Ladies and gentlemen, please be upstanding for the President of Ireland and Miss Sabina. Mr. Michael D. Higgins. Ladies and gentlemen, you can now be seated.
It's a great honour for me to welcome the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and Mrs. Higgins, and to host this important national event on behalf of the city and people of Dublin, held annually on our nearest Sunday to the 27th of January, the date and liberation of the Birkenau in 1945. It is an important date in the calendar of the city. It is an honour to be here among survivors and descendants of survivors of the Holocaust who have made Dublin and Ireland their home. Tonight we will recall the suffering inflicted on the Jewish people and those of other faiths during the Holocaust. We will reflect on this and will speak of our hopes that such acts of inhumanity will become fewer and fewer during our lifetime. This very important event is one of the first in the city's annual calendar. It is a date when we gather to remember the suffering of those who have gone before us, and it gives us an opportunity to also reflect on the suffering still being inflicted throughout the world. The work of the Holocaust Education Trust Ireland must be acknowledged. It is vital to ensure these historical facts are never diluted of our children's children and are properly informed.
The 8th of May 2015 will mark 70 years since the end of World War II, when the Allied forces defeated Nazi Germany and the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed. Every year we solemnly mark Holocaust Memorial Day here in Dublin. We pay tribute to the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. We also pay tribute to the other persecuted minorities and victims of Nazi atrocities. This evening's commemoration provides us with an opportunity to cherish the memory of those who perished and to reflect on the consequences of the Holocaust. I invite President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, to address us.
A Gwynny Cor is privileged for Portugal. I would like to thank the Holocaust Education Trust Ireland for inviting me as President to join you all on this important day, during which we remember the 11 million people, including 6 million Jews, who lost their lives in the concentration camps of Europe. In 2000, Ireland signed the Stockholm Declaration, and in doing so, as a nation, we undertook, along with other European partners and the wider international community, to ensure that the victims of the Holocaust would be remembered. Today, gathered as we are together, we give witness to that commitment. We are honored that some of the survivors of the Holocaust are with us this evening. They have, over the years, acted as witnesses to the horrors of the past, and through their actions they have helped to educate successive generations about the brutal consequences that flow from individuals, groups, cultures, belief systems being chosen as targets for hate and even genocide. May I personally acknowledge and honor those survivors present here this evening. Susie Diamond, John Kaminski, and Tommy Reichenthal. I thank you for coming here and for all that you do and have done to ensure that we do not forget the horrific events that constituted the slaughter of millions of persons across Europe and the concentrated elimination of specified minorities. Nor should we neglect how attitudes and assumptions, left unchecked, made their own preparation and contribution to these events that we recall. 70 years after the Holocaust, it remains an atrocity which we regard and remember with horror, revulsion, and disbelief. We owe so much to the survivors of that atrocity, who continue to bear witness to the terrible inhumanity that can emerge from hatred, prejudice, and intolerance. It is their testimonies over the years, their memoirs, diaries, novels, poems, interviews, and personal accounts, however painful, which have ensured that a terrible stain on human history has not become forgotten or diluted across the distance of years and decades which now separate us from those darkest days of the Second World War. Their personal recollections remind us of the many, many individual stories which make up the narrative of the Shoah, the ruptured families, the lost potential, and the brutal assault on culture and identity, as well, of course, as the courage, generosity of spirit, tenacity, and great will to survive, which are also part of the Holocaust narrative. We are approaching a time, however, when the Holocaust will become a chapter that has passed from the possibility of personal recall into history. It will remain important that future generations learn about and comprehend that chapter in world history, that awful chapter, and all of the hateful assumptions and practices that preceded it, assumptions and practices that now seek to re-emerge in so many places to continue the prejudice, discrimination, and persecution which led to the great failure of humanity that was the Shoah. In the decades to come, the literature of the Holocaust, and indeed its representation in film and in other media, as well as the preservation of the archives of the period, will then take on an even greater importance. The late French philosopher Paul Ricoeur has said that to be forgotten is to die twice, and as humanitarians and fellow human beings, we have a duty to preserve the memory of the many people who had their lives taken so shockingly and so tragically, and that we commit to remembering and drawing lessons from the consequences of actions that have taken place, and from actions that should have happened, but did not, from silences that should have been broken, actions that should have been taken and were not. And at the same time, let us remember two such exceptions as the actions of Hubert Butler and his friends, whose actions must be never forgotten for their courage and their humanity without borders. It is also critical that we focus on the question of how best to ensure an ethical remembrance of the Holocaust. We know that engaging with these horrifying events of the past could never be easy. It involves a complex and sensitive treatment of the manifold narratives, memories, hearts, legacies, and emotions of all those affected by such a past. For some, the burden of that past may be too heavy, too painful to remember. However, forgetting the past, affecting any amnesia, can in itself be a far more harmful and damaging act, and it is surely through remembering consciously and ethically that we acquire the potential to gain release from past wrongs and acquire also the resolution to anticipate and identify any revivals of hate and exclusion. What ought we to remember? What ought we seek to transcend? And what calls for ongoing scholarship? These are the questions which must lie at the heart of any aspiration for the fullness of life. On this Holocaust Memorial Day, let us all commit to a will to remember ethically. In doing so, we must all be committed to the task of facing, opposing, and exposing any and all incipient forms of racism, distortion of sacred texts, and invitations to hate, such as led, for example, to the recent atrocities in Paris. While this is a solemn occasion of remembrance, during which we are commemorating a horrific set of events in European and world history, we must also remember that there is light. There is good to be found in the world, and there are good people who will stand against hatred, destruction, and intolerance, and who will carry the torch of truth and light with them. So as we remember the hateful discrimination that led to the Holocaust and the horrors of that period, we must remember also today what emerged from that tragic episode of European history. In particular, the resolution of the people of Europe to seek to found a new community of nations and peoples founded on the principles and values of human rights and human dignity. Mar focal square is min le molla huat a gachtan if I porchok I gomoran lienu. Ta thisam go will trust fada corriti ve golodin in o'r mast leve hen shotran ona agus gaim buicas livashin for privilege ward se hen if ran farchok sinimak ri hofak shah. So as I have said, may I conclude by commending everyone participating in today's commemoration. So many of you have traveled long distances to be present here this evening, and I thank you for that. It has been a great privilege to be part of this event again.
Simone Weil, Holocaust survivor and founder of the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris, reminds us of the importance of keeping this memory of the Holocaust alive. I invite Minister for Justice and Equality, Francis Fitzgerald, TD, to share Simone Weil's words with us.
The Holocaust was intended not to have any witnesses. The Nazi plan was to erase an entire people from the history and memory of the world. The Jews were not supposed to survive. Everything was planned, thought out, and organized so as not to leave any evidence of the murderous project. The existence of the gas chambers was kept hidden like a state secret. The Nazi death machine was designed to eradicate not only the Jews and Gypsies as peoples, but also all evidence of their annihilation. It was the survivors themselves who first acknowledged their responsibility for passing on knowledge of the Holocaust and keeping its memory alive. For this reason, it is essential to teach about the Shoah, whether there are Jews in your respective countries or not, whether there are many or few or none left. The Shoah should never be diluted, denied, used for other ends, or trivialized.
Ireland was among over 40 countries that signed the Stockholm Declaration in the year 2000. This was an international agreement between governments to commemorate and educate about the Holocaust and to commit their nations to combating racism, anti-Semitism, and intolerance. Ireland is a full member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, undertaking to honour these commitments in education, remembrance, research, and memorialization of the Shoah. I now invite Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Charles Flanagan, TD, to read an excerpt from this important document.
We, the governments attending the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust, recognise that the Holocaust was a tragically defining episode of the 20th century, a crisis for European civilization and a universal catastrophe for all humanity. In declaring that the Holocaust fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization, we share a commitment to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust and to honour those who stood against it. The horrors that engulfed the Jewish people and other victims of the Nazis must forever be seared in our collective memory. With humanity still scarred by genocide, anti-Semitism, ethnic cleansing, racism, xenophobia, and other expressions of hatred and discrimination, we share a solemn responsibility to fight against these evils and to reaffirm our common aspiration for a democratic and tolerant society, free of prejudice and other forms of bigotry.
The impact of the Holocaust on Europe is profound, affecting all of us. I now invite Mary Banotti, former MEP and founding trustee of Holocaust Education Trust Ireland, to give her reading.
I was fortunate when I joined the European Parliament to have many colleagues who had survived the war. They could vividly remember the horrors of those years, for they had lived through them. My colleagues were powerful reminders of the vital necessity to avoid further conflict and to be ever mindful of the atrocities so many of them had witnessed. The Holocaust created a hole in the heart of Europe, where 2/3 of the Jewish people were destroyed. It holds a significant place in Europe's shared history and public memory. This has strengthened Europe's commitment to peace after 2 world wars and has mostly enabled us to adhere to peaceful coexistence for more than 70 years, thus heeding the lessons of the experience of the Holocaust has taught us.
There were thriving Jewish communities throughout Europe, some dating back more than 2,000 years. When the Nazis came to power, they attempted to destroy not only the Jewish people, but also their culture and their history. They soon condemned all things Jewish as un-German. I now invite Kevin McCarthy, Senior Inspector with the Department of Education and Skills, to give his reading about the book burnings that erupted throughout the university towns of Germany in March 1933.
Jewish books and books by Jewish authors were burned in public bonfires, along with other books considered by Hitler and the Nazis to be degenerate. Students came forward with whole armfuls of books, while schoolboys screamed into the microphone their condemnation of this and that author, and as each name was mentioned, the crowd booed and hissed. Some of the finest works of German Jewish literature, history, philosophy, art, and science were destroyed, as Jewish cultural heritage was obliterated. The writer Heinrich Heine had prophetically remarked 100 years earlier, "Where they burn books, they will, in the end, burn human beings."
In 1935, The Nuremberg laws deprived Jews of their German citizenship. Jewish people were classified as a race and dismissed from their places of work. Gradually, Jewish people were squeezed out of German society. I now invite Oliver Sears, whose mother Monica was born in Łódź and survived the Holocaust, to give his reading on the impact of these anti-Jewish restrictions.
Jews were dismissed from the civil service, the army, universities, and the media. Jewish businesses, banks, and bank accounts were closed or confiscated. Jews were not allowed in public places, swimming pools, or ice rinks. They could no longer sit on park benches which had "Not for Jews" stenciled on them. They could no longer go to restaurants, bars, bookshops, or barbers. They couldn't ride on trams, go to the cinema, the theatre, or to the opera. Even if they could, they would not hear music written by Jews, played by Jews, or sung by Jews. There were SA men everywhere, preventing Jews from going wherever they had always been able to go.
1938 was a very significant year for the Jewish people of Europe. Nazi anti-Semitic policies were intensified. As pressure was put on Jews to leave Germany and German-occupied lands, hundreds of thousands tried to flee. In July of that year, President Franklin D. Roosevelt convened an international conference in Evian-les-Bains in France to consider the Jewish refugee crisis that was unfolding. I now invite Maurice Cohen, Chairman of the Jewish Representative Council of Ireland, to tell us about the Evian Conference.
"32 countries were represented at Evian, including Ireland. Most countries said that they had no room for Jews and that their quotas were already full. One country even stated that no Jew is too many. Out of all of the nations present at the Evian conference, none were willing to take in more Jewish refugees. With nowhere to turn, the Jews found themselves trapped within their own borders, and the Evian conference was deemed a failure.
After years of official harassment of Jews in Nazi Germany, the state-sanctioned violence of Kristallnacht on the 9th of November 1938 marked the acceleration of Jewish persecution that would ultimately culminate in the Holocaust. I invite Klaus Unger to give his reading about the November pogrom.
Kristallnacht erupted across Germany and Austria, during which hundreds of Jewish synagogues, homes, schools, and businesses were destroyed and set ablaze. Windows were smashed, leaving the streets strewn with glass. 91 Jews were murdered that night, and 30,000 Jewish men were thrown into concentration camps. After the destruction, the Jewish communities were fined 1 billion Reichmark to pay for the damage. The violence of Kristallnacht convinced the Jews of Germany and Austria that they were in imminent danger.
With the outbreak of World War II, the German armies swept through Europe. In all the countries occupied by the Nazis, Jewish people were forced to wear an identifying mark. The Star of David, which had always been a symbol of pride for Jewish people, was turned into a symbol of humiliation by the Nazis. I now invite Rachel O'Mahony to give a reading from the diary of 16-year-old Moshe from Holland about wearing the yellow star.
An order was issued that from now on, Jews have to wear a yellow star-shaped patch. The order tells exactly how big the star patch must be, and that it must be sewn on every outer garment, jacket, or coat. This badge of shame was the Star of David, on which the word Jew was written.
A small number of Jewish Holocaust survivors live in Ireland. All of them were children during the time of the Holocaust, and all of them found their way to Ireland by different means. Each of them lost many family members, and each has his or her own personal tale of survival. Dr. Bob Collis, a volunteer doctor with the British Red Cross, worked in Bergen-Belsen immediately after the war. He brought 5 orphans back with him to Ireland, as no homes or relatives could be found for them in their native lands. Amongst those children were brother and sister Zoltan and Edith Zinn Collis, whom Bob reared in his own home. They took Bob's name as part of their own and lived fulfilling lives in Ireland for more than 60 years. They both passed away in December 2012, leaving behind their Irish families, many of whom are with us here this evening. Susie and Terry Samuels from Hungary were another brother and sister whom Bob brought to Ireland. I now invite Holocaust survivor Susie Diamond to give her reading.
In July 1944, Adolf Eichmann oversaw the roundup, deportation and gassing of over 430,000 Hungarian Jews in Auschwitz-Birkenau. I was born Susie Molnar in Debrecen, the second largest town in Hungary, in 1943. We were a small family comprising my mother Gisela, my father Sandor, my brother Terry, and me. One night, my father was taken away, and soon afterwards, the Gestapo came for the rest of us. We were forced onto the last transport to leave Hungary in September 1944. We were first sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, and then to Bergen-Belsen, where we remained until liberation. My mother died of TB just after the British arrived. Terry and I were very young children and learned that we were the only 2 members of our family to have survived the Holocaust. Dr. Bob Collis, who was working in Bergen-Belsen with the British Red Cross, found Terry and me and brought us back with him to Ireland, along with Zoltan and Edith Zinn and a couple of other orphans. Eventually, Bob arranged for Terry and I to be adopted by a Jewish couple, Elsie and Willie Samuels, in Dublin. In time, we both married and reared our own children. My brother passed away in 2007, which makes me deeply aware of how fast the clock is ticking for those of us who survived the Holocaust.
More than 1,000 ghettos were created throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. I now invite Councillor Dermot Lacey of Dublin City Council to tell us about the ghettos, and Jemima Turley to read from the diary of 13-year-old Eva from Romania.
It is estimated that more than 1 million Jews died in the ghettos, which were created in every country occupied by the Germans. They were established in poor and run-down areas of cities and large towns, with little sanitation and chronic overcrowding. Ghettos were usually sited close to railways and often near killing sites or death camps. Many ghettos were walled in or fenced off, and Jews who left them without permission were severely punished. The cruelty, poor living conditions, overcrowding and disease contributed to the death toll. Although there are heroic stories of resistance, most of the ghetto populations were murdered and there were few survivors.
The fence was finished, and nobody can go out or come in. And on every house, they've posted a notice which tells exactly what we're allowed to do. Actually, everything is forbidden, but the most awful thing is that the punishment for everything is death. It doesn't actually say that this punishment also applies to children, but I think it does apply to us too.
In 1941, Germany invaded Russia in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. I now invite Peter Gary from the École Européenne 3 to tell us about this brutal episode in the Holocaust narrative.
When the German army invaded Russia in June 1941, it was followed by killing squads called Einsatzgruppen. They rounded up Jews in the shtetls, towns and villages, forcing them into cemeteries, forests and ravines, where thousands were murdered at point-blank range. Many had to dig their own graves before being shot into them. Entire communities were obliterated, and it is estimated that more than 1.5 million Jews were murdered in these killing sites by the Einsatzgruppen.
Holocaust survivor Jan Kamiński was just 10 years old when the Jewish population of Bilgoraj, his native village in Poland, was rounded up and murdered in 1942. I now invite his daughter, Jadcia Kamińska, to give Jan's reading on behalf of her father, who is also here with us tonight.
I was born Chaim Schul-Zibner, the second youngest of 4 children, in the town of Bilgoraj in eastern Poland, which is not far from the city of Lublin and the border with Ukraine. About 70 kilometers away, the Nazi death camp of Belzec was established. At the time, 5,000 Jews lived in Bilgoraj, which was more than half the population of the town. As Nazi killing squads swept through eastern territories, my family were incarcerated in the ghetto in the centre of the town. On the 3rd and 9th of November 1942, the Jewish population of Bilgoraj were dispatched to a certain and immediate death at the Belzec death camp. During the final ghetto roundup, I fled into a nearby forest and became permanently separated from my family. It was no longer safe to identify myself as Jewish, and I became Jan Kamiński, surviving the war on the run, foraging and hiding in woods, living off farms, always on the run and having to live off my wits. Eventually, in July 1944, I linked up with the Russian Army Polish Corps and became a child soldier in the 21st Artillery Regiment at 12 years of age. After liberation, I spent time in Europe before eventually coming to England and then Ireland as a political refugee. After the war, we learned that the once flourishing Jewish communities of Poland had been completely destroyed. My entire family had been wiped out. My parents, Shulam and Mindla, my sister Hannah Matla and Rivka, and my baby brother, whose name is not recorded, had all disappeared. Anti-Semitism still prevailed in Poland and elsewhere, and pogroms against Jews were still taking place. It was impossible to think of rebuilding Jewish life in Poland then. Today there is a modest project of Jewish revival taking place in Bilgoraj, but so far, after nearly 30 years of searching for them, no traces of my direct family have been found.
Word reached Berlin that some members of the killing squads found their work distressing. This prompted the convening of the Wannsee Conference to discuss a more efficient way of killing the Jewish people of Europe. I now invite Brian Fanning, professor in the School of Applied Social Science at University College Dublin, to give his reading.
At the Wannsee Conference, Reinhard Heydrich asked the participants to endorse Hitler's plans to totally annihilate the Jews of Europe. Eichmann presented the delegates with a list of the numbers of Jews living in each European country. Ireland appears on the list with a total of 4,000 Jews. The delegates debated at length who was Jewish according to bloodline considerations and discussed evacuation and resettlement of the Jews. They concluded that a more efficient method of murder was necessary, one that would produce little residue and spare those operating the killing sites the negative psychological trauma of face-to-face killing. Over fine food, brandy and cigars, it took the delegates less than 2 hours to unanimously endorse Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question, the murder of the Jewish people by poison gas.
There were many different types of camps created by the Nazis. I now invite John Lonergan, former governor of Mountjoy Prison, to tell us about the camp system operated by the SS. Jake Turley and Saul Strelitz will read from the diaries of 17-year-old Jacob and 14-year-old Kitty, who were both from Poland.
There were hundreds of concentration camps, slave labour camps, and deportation camps established throughout the territories of the Third Reich. Jews and others incarcerated in these camps perished from brutality, exhaustion, cold, hunger, and disease. 6 death camps were established by the Nazis, all of them on Polish soil, where approximately 3 million Jews and thousands of others were murdered in gas chambers. Prisoners were selected to live or to die. 90% were selected for death. They were ushered into undressing areas where they were told to leave their clothes neatly on the pegs provided and to tie their shoes together to make them easier to find when they came back from the showers. They never came back. Their clothing, shoes, and personal belongings were sorted and sold in markets back in Germany. Human hair was used in the manufacture of textiles. This systematic industrial process of murder was unprecedented in human history.
First of all, we had to strip off all our clothes, and then we had to walk into the next room completely undressed. Here we were given our numbers. The commandant said to us, "From now on, you are all numbers. You have no identity. You have no name. You have no place of origin."
As evening came, the whole sky was red. Smoke and flames were pouring out of all the chimneys. None of us slept that night. It was no longer possible to pretend, even to yourself, that the stories were not really true. All that we had heard and guessed was now before our eyes. Here were the death factories.
The Nazis said that eliminating people with disabilities and disabling conditions would strengthen and purify German blood. They initiated the T4 euthanasia program as a method of removing disabled people from German society. I now invite John Dolan, CEO of Disability Federation of Ireland, to give his reading.
The Nazis considered all people with intellectual and physical disabilities as life unworthy of life and as a burden on the state. High school textbooks contained examples of maths problems calculating the costs of care for people with disabilities compared to the costs of caring for a healthy person. The use of gas vans, endorsed by doctors and nurses, in the mass murder of disabled people, demonstrated with grim efficiency that a similar method of murder could be applied to others on a far larger scale.
Six million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, and hundreds of thousands of other minorities were also targeted. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Hitler ordered the murder of the Polish intelligentsia. I now invite Aneta Stepien of the Department of Russian and Slavonic Studies at Trinity College, Dublin, to tell us about the persecution of Polish people by the Nazis.
Hitler had declared that Poland was to be totally destroyed and its educated and professional people annihilated. Tens of thousands of Polish political and church leaders, intellectuals, professionals, entrepreneurs, landowners, and others were murdered or sent to concentration camps. Polish universities, scientific institutions, schools, museums, and libraries were closed down. Polish children did not progress beyond primary school, and thousands were forcibly taken to Germany to be Aryanized and reared as Germans. It is estimated that 3 million Poles were murdered by the Nazis.
Due to their nomadic lifestyle and unwritten history, it is difficult to know the exact number of Romani people who were murdered by the Nazis, but estimates put the figure between 250,000 and 500,000. I now invite Gabi Muntian, community development worker with the Roma Project at Pave Point, to give her reading about the persecution and genocide of the Roma during the Holocaust.
Hundreds of thousands of Roma and Sinti people were rounded up, forced into ghettos, and deported to concentration and death camps. Thousands of Roma were labeled as social and had to wear identifying black triangle in the camps. As social were considered to be criminals and useless to the national communities. Thousands of Roma and Sinti people died from gassing, starvation, disease, forced labor, and medical experiments.
During the interwar years, Berlin became a cultural hub. It was a vibrant and liberal city where diversity was accepted and embraced. This changed dramatically when the Nazis came to power. I now invite Kieran Rose of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission to tell us about the persecution of homosexuals during the Holocaust.
The Nazis arrested thousands of gay men who they imprisoned in concentration camps. They were forced to wear pink triangles on their camp uniforms, and lesbians were forced to wear black triangles. In the concentration camps, homosexuals were subjected to harder work, less food, and greater brutality than other inmates. Thousands were put to death. The criminalization and social stigmatization of homosexuals in Europe and the United States remained in force for many years after World War II, and homosexual survivors of Nazi persecution were not acknowledged as victims of the Holocaust. Some even had to serve out the terms of their original prison sentences, which did not take into account the time that they had spent incarcerated in concentration camps. Few homosexual survivors of the Holocaust ever told their stories.
After 1933, the Nazis targeted hundreds of mixed-race children who were born in Germany. I now invite Clement Easter-Barman, Director General at Ireland West Africa Business and Economic Council, to tell us about the Nazi persecution of black and mixed-race people.
Black people have suffered persecution throughout history. In 1933, the Nazis established Commission Number 3, which was a program of forced sterilization of hundreds of adults and children of African ancestry. The Nuremberg race laws have stated that black people were inferior. By the outbreak of the Second World War, thousands of black, mixed race, and people of ethnic minorities had fled Germany, but a great number of those who remained were murdered.
Many political dissidents actively opposed the Nazis from the earliest days of the regime. I now invite Kim Bielenberg, whose grandfather, Fritz von der Schulenburg, was among those involved in the July plot to assassinate Hitler, to give his reading.
The Nazis persecuted thousands of political dissidents and opponents, some for what they did, some for what they refused to do, and some for what they were. The torching of the Reichstag, National Parliament building in 1933, gave the Nazis a pretext for brutally suppressing the communists and later the Social Democrats. They abolished trade unions and cooperatives, confiscated their assets, and prohibited strikes. As early as 1933, the Nazis established the first concentration camp, Dachau, as a place of detention for political prisoners.
Although a great many Christians were Nazis, we are also mindful of the many thousands of Christians who were persecuted and murdered for opposing Hitler and for saving Jews. I now invite Peter Admirand of the Mater Dei Institute and Dublin City University to give his reading about the Christian victims of the Holocaust.
In their efforts to eliminate opposition, the Nazis also targeted priests, nuns, teachers, and the intelligentsia. They persecuted and murdered thousands of Catholics, Protestants, and others of Christian affiliation. Jehovah's Witnesses were persecuted and murdered by the Nazis for their refusal to salute Hitler as savior or to serve in the German army. A great number of priests and nuns also saved Jews during the Holocaust. The Quakers worked tirelessly during the early years of the Reich to assist those trying to escape from Hitler's tyranny. There were thousands of righteous Christians and thousands of Christian victims.
I now invite Helen Marks, President of the Dublin Jewish Progressive Congregation, to give her reading about the uniqueness of the Holocaust for the Jewish people.
The final solution was a systematic attempt by the Nazis and their collaborators to murder every Jew in every country of Europe. 6 million Jews, 2/3 of European Jewry, perished in the Holocaust. 1.5 million of these victims were children. The Nazis also murdered millions of other victims. But as Elie Wiesel reminds us, it is true that not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims.
A great number of Holocaust survivors made their homes in Israel after the war. I now invite His Excellency, Mr. Boaz Modai, Ambassador of Israel, to give his reading about the close association with Israel and the Shoah.
As the International Holocaust Remembrance Day looms each year, I find myself wondering again how the Shoah could ever have happened in Europe. How a supposedly enlightened society could have permitted the attempted annihilation of the entire Jewish race. As we ponder how the Shoah came about, we see that it was facilitated by a tactic of Hitler to dehumanize the Jews. The Nazi propaganda brainwashed people into believing the Jews were subhuman and deserved to be treated as such. The Jews controlled all the media and the money in the world, and if they ceased to exist, the world would be a better place. As we gather here tonight, we commit to ensuring that people never forget the inhuman tragedy that the Jewish people experienced on the soil of the European continent. Europe has long ago recognized the evils that were perpetrated on this continent and committed to the slogan of never again. As we sit here tonight, can we say with absolute certainty that dehumanizations of Jews is not happening again? Are there not regimes that teach their peoples, and especially the younger generations, to believe that there is one country in the world whose citizens should not be treated as human? A country that has to confront the 3 Ds, dehumanization, delegitimation, and double standard? This country happens to be the only Jewish state in the world, Israel. They seek to demonize the state of Israel, which, had it existed as an independent state at the time of the Shoah, could have prevented the extermination of many of those people. Sadly, during the years of the Second World War and the industrialized extermination of the Jews by the Nazis and their collaborators, most of our people had no place to escape to. Almost the entire European continent was embroiled in war, and there was no safe haven for them. In the aftermath of the Shoah, the destitute survivors, those whom the exterminators had not succeeded in murdering in time, found themselves with very few options. After 1945, most Jewish survivors could not go back to the homes they had lived in before the war. Even the Western countries, whose armies had liberated them from the death camps, were slow to take in numbers needing new homes. In parts of Eastern Europe, pogroms and massacres against them continued. Hundreds of thousands of dispossessed and displaced refugees spent several years stagnating in transit camps. At last, in 1948, after a long and bloody struggle for independence, the State of Israel was established, and those people could finally find a refuge and a homeland. The terrible events of recent weeks in France have demonstrated yet again the lesson of history we learned so painfully in the Shoah, that the fate of Jewish people living abroad, that is, outside the boundaries of their nation state, is not always a certain one. On this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we should all remember the importance of the very existence of the State of Israel. Israel, the homeland of the Jewish people, must continue to be a place which Jews, wherever they live in the world, can come to live in if and when they feel that there is no longer a place for them elsewhere. Jews everywhere must know that there is one place which will be their bastion, one place where they can feel safe, one place that guarantees there will not ever be another Shoah. That place is Israel, the nation state founded by the Jewish people themselves.
Tommy Reichenthal, was only a small 6-year-old boy when Slovakia became an Axis partner of Nazi Germany. He was 9 years of age when he was captured by the Gestapo and deported to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, along with other family members. I now invite Tommy to give his reading.
I am here today not because who I am, but because what I am. I am a Jew and I am a survivor of the Holocaust. We must remember that the Holocaust did not start with gas chamber, but with whisper, town, and abuse. It was about racism, loss of freedom, loss of dignity, humiliation, loss of education, confiscation of property, enslavement, starvation, torture, execution, and finally mass murder, the final solution. I was 9-year-old when I was captured by the Nazi along with my mother, grandmother, aunt, brother, and cousin. We were herded into a cattle car, and from that moment onwards, we were treated worse than animals. There was no privacy or hygiene. The stench and conditions were unbearable. Eventually, after 7 nights, the cattle train stopped. The doors were open and we were greeted by shouts from the SS with guns at the ready and the barking of their Alsatian dog. We had arrived at our destination, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. I was there from November 1944 until the liberation of the camp in April 1945. What I witnessed as a 9-year-old boy is impossible to describe. The starvation, the cruelty of the camp guard, the cold and the disease. People who were just skin and bone and looked like living skeletons were walking around very slowly, some of them dropping to the ground, never to get up again. They were dying in their hundreds. Their emaciated bodies left where they fell or thrown into heaps. In front of our barracks, there were piles of decomposing corpses. For many prisoners in Bergen-Belsen, the conditions were too much to bear, and they threw themselves at the barbed wire at night to be shot in order to put the end to their misery. We found their corpses there in the morning. 70,000 prisoners of Bergen-Belsen are buried there in mass grave. I lost 35 members of my family in the Holocaust. The Holocaust must never be forgotten and must never be compared to anything that happened since.
Every one of the Jews murdered in the Holocaust was killed because he or she was Jewish. There were teachers, professors, rabbis, economists, academics, doctors, surgeons, nurses, vets, lawyers, engineers, pharmacists, scholars, and students. There were war veterans, policemen, industrialists, peasants, farmers, artists, musicians, writers, businessmen, laborers, peddlers, shopkeepers, clerks, and civil servants. There were the elderly, housewives, widows, school children, and babies. We must prevent future generations from thinking of the Holocaust in terms of anonymous, faceless numbers. Each victim has a name. Several people living in Ireland lost cherished family members in the Holocaust, whose names we have included in the scroll of names. In this small way, we will honor their memory and give them a personal Irish memorial. I invite pupils of Stratford College, Dublin, Ord Sculna Trinoida at Thai, St. Michael's College, Dublin, to read from the Scroll of Names.
Max Heller, Clara Heller, Gazelle Molnar, Sander Molnar, Bila Hirschberg, Matthias Hirschberg, Rolcha Orgel, Feivel Orgel, Slasma Urbach, Hirsch Urbach, Tauba Urbach, David Joseph Urbach, Shaul Urbach, Abes V Urbach, Gietla Friedla,
Rukla Golda
Leah
Urbach,
Fagla,
Sarah
Nuklem Mordecai,
Urbach, Hill Urbach, Shimon Urbach, Nukum Urbach, Fagla Urbach, Perla Urbach, Farmita Urbach, Moses Klein, Hilda Frankel, Kurt Frankel, Walter Frankel, Herbert Frankel,
Caroline
Fritz
Wolf,
Frankel,
Martin
Zygmunt
Wolf,
Frankel,
Wolfgang
Salaman
Wolf,
Delma,
Sally Wolf, Henrietta Wolf, Rosetta Wolf, Elie Velvel Vavisansky, David Philip, Rekha Philip, Leopold Philip, Julia Philip, Dagbert Philip, Louis Philip, Valeria Philip,
Geza
Rosalia
Seri,
Shaimovich,
Oscar
Julius Mayer.
Shanovich, Adela Fried, Bella Fried, Katerina Fried, Agnes Fried, Ezekiel Reichenthal, Katerina Reichenthal, Kalmar Reichenthal, Ilona Reichenthal, Gita Reichenthal, Ibi Reichenthal, Desideer Reichenthal, Ferdinand Alt, Renka Alt,
Joseph
Erna
Drexler,
Albert,
Bedriska
Marta
Drexler,
Albert,
Paul Drexler, Mita Drexler, Bella Perlberg, Irma Popper, Ephraim Neyman, Zvi Neyman, Haya Zelcher, Israel Zelcher, 5 Zelcher children, Roiza Sentnershver, Moshe Sentnershver, 6 Sentnershver children, Fischel Bernholtz,
Label Neyman,
Mrs. Bernholtz,
Mrs. L. Neyman,
Bernholtz children,
Neyman children, Manachem Neyman, Mrs. M. Neyman, Neyman children, Mordecai Steinbach, Hendel Steinbach, Sarah Steinbach, Esther Steinbach, Masha Steinbach, Mare Steinbach, Regina Steinbach, Israel Steinbach, Hinda Steinbach,
Mare Hoffman,
Hertz Hoffman,
Ella Hoffman,
Haya Hoffman,
Hoffman children, Zelig Hoffman, Mordecai Hoffman, Baruch Gottlieb, Roise Gottlieb, Gottlieb children, Rachmiel Smojevic, Sarah Frimet Smojevic, Aria Leiby Smojevic, Leah Laiko Smojevic, Rachel Rochelle Smojevic,
Yura Mataya,
Devora Smojevic,
Alicia Mataya,
Miriam Pulla,
Anisha Mataya,
Doyet Bellini,
Kalman Rottenhall, Eleonora Rottenhall, Abraham Susel, Pauline Susel, David Susel, Simon Susel, Regina Susel, Rafi Susel, Marta Susel, Shaftai Susel, Luisi Susel, Moshe Yom Tov
Manuel
Susel,
Brudo,
Adela
Susel
Susel,
children,
Agnes
Henrik
Susel
Heinbach,
Brudo,
Salma Heinbach, Simcha Zaks, Rivka Zaks, Burrell Zaks, Sissy Zaks, Nachman Zaks, Hannah Zaks, Aaron Zaks, Hannah Sherhai, Joel Dove Zaks,
Shoshana
Bendik
Zaks,
Zaks,
Shina
Leah
Zaks,
Zadak, Jatel
Masha
Zaks,
Zaks, Rosa Zaks, Tyler Fage Fachler, David Meyer Fachler, Moshe Fachler, Gayla Fachler, Sheena Del Melechman, Yechiel Melechman, Theo Melechman, Joseph Melechman, Pepi Jijob,
Nusin Nod Fachler,
Haya Melechman,
Esther Zark
Yokove Melechman,
Meme Alt
Chaim Meir Melechman,
Live Fachler, Izzy Fachler, Nathan Fachler, Johanna Carlsberg Summer, Emil Summer, Eddie Steinberg, Leon Gluck, Wojciech Gluck, Mushu Tabakalik, Zahara Tabowski, Rachel Tabowski,
Joseph
Hatzko
Abram,
Abram, Balia
Sailor
Abram,
Cohen, Ida Cohen, Henrik Hirsch, Caroline Hirsch, Elsa Simak, Danny Simak, Chana Malta Seibner, Rywaka Seibner, Baby Seibner, Minla Seibner, Sol Seibner, Frandla Seibner, daughter of Frandla, Joseph Seibner, Chandler Seibner.
The timing of Holocaust Memorial Day is linked to the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau on the 27th of January 1945. It was a difficult moment for survivors of the Holocaust. Albert Sutton from Malahide in Dublin joined the RAF as a leading aircraftsman in 1940 and served during World War II as a non-commissioned officer. He saw action in Normandy, Belgium, and Holland. At the end of the war, he was in Denmark. He drove back through Germany with his unit, noticing the white flags of surrender displayed on every house. I now invite World War II veteran Albert Sutton to give his reading, and Gina Cohen to read from the diary of 12-year-old Chava from Poland.
I was in Germany at the end of the war when we were asked by other British forces to assist in opening some of the concentration camps in the region. As we approached Bergen-Belsen, we were assaulted by an indescribable stench which reached us a few miles away from the gates. Once inside the camp, we saw piles of corpses, the emaciated survivors, and the ghost-like victims dying in front of our eyes. On confronting the horrors of the camps, we were glad to be of help, even at this late stage, and all of us felt our military service had been worthwhile. On meeting survivors like Susie and Tommy, I will do it all again.
We had been liberated. I was no longer only a number, doomed to die in a Nazi gas chamber, a prisoner without the right to live. Germany had been defeated. Once again, I was an ordinary girl. True, I was different from other girls my age, very different in many ways, but I was free.
In 1963, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority in Israel, inaugurated the Award of Righteous Among the Nations to honor non-Jews who risked their lives and those of their families to to help save Jews during the Holocaust. In 2013, Mary Elizabeth Elmes became the first Irish person to be awarded Righteous Among the Nations for saving Jewish children in France during the Holocaust. I now invite Anastasia Crickley of Maynooth University, member of the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the Council of Europe Committee Framework Convention for Protection of National Minorities, to give her reading.
Only a fraction of the Jewish people in Nazi-occupied Europe were saved. And yet, thousands of non-Jews, including Christians and Muslims, in every country occupied by the Third Reich, voluntarily risked their lives to save Jews, also putting their own families in jeopardy. There are approximately 25,000 names of righteous listed in the Yad Vashem records, but the true number is probably double that figure. Many righteous never recounted their heroic deeds to their own families or sought recognition, sometimes out of fear of arousing resentment and further anti-Jewish sentiments. The story of the righteous is one of exceptional goodness that emerged in the midst of unspeakable tragedy and destruction. It is ironic that the nightmare and horrors of the Holocaust also became a defining moment of courage and decency for humanity. Not only those Jews who have been personally saved by the righteous owe them their lives, but also all of their descendants. As the Talmudic verse teaches us, "For he who saves one life is regarded as if he has saved the entire world."
In 1938, Hubert Butler traveled from Ireland to Vienna with one objective in mind: to bring Jewish refugees to Ireland. He was motivated by a humanitarian concern for the plight of Jews in Europe following the rise of Hitler. The record of Hubert Butler's humanitarian and noble conduct is preserved in the Yad Vashem archives. I now invite Hubert's granddaughter, Susanna Crampton, to give her reading about her grandfather.
Both at home and at the Evian Conference convened in 1938 to address the Jewish refugee crisis, Hubert Butler was struck by the indifference of his fellow countrymen to the suffering of the Jews in Europe. As an Irishman, he was driven to act by his profound anger and disappointment with the attitudes and apathy of anti-Semitism displayed by the Irish establishment, and went to work in the Quaker Center for Refugees in Vienna. Through his work with the Quakers, Hubert Butler succeeded in bringing a number of Jewish refugees to Ireland, despite the Irish government restrictions. He helped them settle in Ireland or secured passage onwards to North and South America, among other destinations. My grandfather described his time in Vienna working to rescue Jews as one of the happiest times of his life. However, he was also profoundly struck by the hatred that was growing and the horrors to which it would inevitably lead. Reflecting on his time there, he wrote, "I think now it was obtuse of us not to have anticipated Auschwitz. I had walked along the Peterstrasse to the great Viennese park where bands played and stalls sold ice cream and coffee. The street must have had a great many Jewish shopkeepers in it, because all the way down there were broken windows in front of looted shops with "Gone for a rest cure to Dachau" scrawled over the surviving panes, and the air was full of the mindless hatred which war, that fosters all our basest passions, would inevitably make murderous.
There are hundreds of thousands of children of Holocaust survivors who are referred to as second generation. There is a large community of them around the world. I now invite Riva Newman and Caroline Zinn Collis to give their readings.
Two months ago, I closed a circle in my life and opened a new one. I closed the circle of being second generation of Holocaust survivors and became a Holocaust survivor myself. As I was standing last month next to my dying father's bed in the hospital and saw his bruised arm and his Auschwitz tattoo, I realized that from now on, it is my responsibility to tell his story and pass it on to the next generations. Both of my parents were young when they stepped down from the cattle cars on the platform in Auschwitz-Birkenau. My mother was 14 and my father 19. This generation is disappearing. My mother died 14 years ago, and now, after the passing of my father, it is my duty and responsibility to tell the world how my parents' lives were shattered, how in a matter of hours everything and everyone that was dear to them was brutally gone. They saw in their young eyes all the horrors around them. And why? Only because they were Jews. I, a proud mother and grandmother of 4, who live in a kibbutz in the Jewish homeland Israel, together with my sister and her children and grandchildren, who also live in Israel, are my parents' final victory. Those young survivors pulled themselves from the ashes, rebuilt their lives, and taught us to be proud of who we are, to love mankind, and to rejoice in life. Today, I'm taking on a new responsibility to tell my personal Holocaust survivor's story. Today, I take the responsibility to tell the world, never again.
When we were growing up, we were the only 4 girls in our local school who could spell Czechoslovakia correctly. Our father came from that country. We have been born with the title second generation, and we have got used to the reality of very small families, at least from one side. No grandparents, no uncles, no aunts. But we can also rejoice in our own lives, in our new families, our children and our grandchildren. Hitler did not win. One or both of our parents survived, and we are here, living our lives, looking towards the future.
One of our greatest challenges is teaching the lessons of the Holocaust for the future. I now invite Éadon O'Riordan, TD, Minister of State for New Communities, Culture and Equality, to give his reading.
The Holocaust is an event that happened at the core of our civilization, the heart of our culture, and in the midst of societies resembling our own. The Holocaust was mainly about the Jewish people, but its lessons are universal. So many Holocaust victims were betrayed by trust, betrayed by justice, betrayed by the pillars that uphold our very society and our way of life. The burden of damage has been passed through the generations. Our duty is clear. It is not enough to be good. We must know what to do when we face evil. It is not enough to know what we stand for. We must know what we stand against. It is not enough to educate our own children about tolerance. We must lift the crippling burden of hate from all children of the world. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers and crematoria. It began with prejudice and attitudes. The story of the Holocaust calls on us to strengthen our resolve to combat anti-Semitism, in all its manifestations, to reject Holocaust denial, and to commit ourselves to challenging every example of intolerance that we witness.
The first Holocaust memorial in Ireland was unveiled in the Garden of Europe in 1995 in Listowel, County Kerry. Paddy Fitzgibbon, who inaugurated the project, delivered a moving speech at the time. I now invite the Honourable Mrs. Susan Denham, the Chief Justice, to read an extract from Paddy's profound words on that occasion.
Our generation and the generation or two after us will be the last that will be able to say that we stood and shook the hands of some of those who survived. Go home from this place and tell your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren that today in Listowel you looked into eyes that witnessed the most cataclysmic events ever unleashed by mankind upon mankind. Tell them that you met people who will still be remembered, still talked about, and still wept over 10,000 years from now. Because if they are not, there will be no hope for us at all. The Holocaust happened, and it can happen again. And every one of us, if only for our own self-preservation, has a solemn duty to ensure that nothing like it ever occurs again.
We will now observe a minute's silence in memory of the men, women, and children who perished in the Holocaust. Could I ask you, please, to stand? It is traditional at Holocaust memorial events to light 6 candles in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Shoah. In Ireland, we also light candles in memory of all of the other victims of Nazi atrocities. The first candles are in memory of people with disabilities and disabling conditions who were murdered, starved to death, and forcibly sterilized by doctors and other willing helpers. I call upon Deirdre Spain of Inclusion Ireland and Eric Casey, Los Pisa Club, St. John of God, Sandyford, to light their candles. We will always remember. The next candles are in memory of millions of Poles and Slavs who were murdered, displaced, and forcibly Aryanized by the Nazis, and the thousands of ethnic minorities who were persecuted, sterilized, and murdered in the Holocaust. I call upon Salome Mbugua of Akidwa and Joanna Szawirska of the Irish-Polish Society to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of the Romani people of Europe who were rounded up, deported, murdered, displaced, and forcibly sterilized by the Nazis, I call upon Diana Powen, Roma representative, and Emmanuel Powen, Pave Point, to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of homosexual men and women who were persecuted and murdered because of their sexual orientation, I call upon Natalie Wiedik, co-chair of Glen, and Raz DJ Sheridan of Belong to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of the political victims of the Holocaust, socialists, communists, trade unionists, Democrats, and other anti-Nazi dissidents, I call upon Ken McHugh of Sport Against Racism and Mary Lawler, Director of Frontline Defenders, to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of Christian victims of all denominations, including the Jehovah's Witnesses, who were persecuted and murdered by the Nazis, I call upon Sister Ellen Knox of the Sisters of Sion and Reverend Alan Martin, retired minister of the Presbyterian Church, to light their candles. We will always remember. 6 candles are dedicated to the memory of the 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children, who were annihilated in the Holocaust by the Nazis and their collaborators. Jews were murdered in concentration camps, labor camps, and death camps. Jews perished in the ghettos. Jews died of starvation and disease. Jews were shot in the forests, and Jews were murdered in the streets and in their homes. Those lighting candles in memory of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust are children or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, 2nd and 3rd generation. All of them lost countless members of their families in the Holocaust. I call upon Brenda Borchardt, whose grandparents, Haskell Abram and Belia Abram, and many family members perished in the Holocaust. Mark Heinbach, whose grandparents, Heinrich Heinbach and Selma Heinbach, and other family members perished in the Holocaust. Tony Collis, whose grandfather, Zoltan, survived Bergen-Belsen and whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. Marina Herbst, in memory of the many members of the Herbst and Kohn families who perished in the Holocaust. Joe Katz, whose mother Frida survived Auschwitz and whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. Charlotte Kaplan, whose father, Raphael Urbach, survived Buchenwald and Theresienstadt, and whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. We will always remember. I invite Cantor Alwyn Schulman of the Irish Jewish community to chant the prayer for the repose of the soul of the departed.
Hamtzei menochanechona al kanefei ashechina b'ma'alot kedoshim u'tehorim b'ma'alot kedoshim u'tehorim kezar harakia mehirim u'mazhirim et nishmat achein b'nei Yisrael הקדושים והטהורים שנפלו בידי הרוצחים ונשפך דמם באושוויץ, מיידניק, טרבלינקה ובשאר מחנות השמד באירופה שנהרגו, שנשחטו ושנשרפו ושנטבעו ושנחנקו על קידוש השם בעבור שאנו מתפללים בעד הזכרת נשמותיהם בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים יצרור בזרור החיים את נשמתם אדוני הוא נחלתם וינוחו המשכבותם בשלום ונאמר amen.
During the Holocaust, civilized society lost its moral compass and became complicit in mass murder and genocide. Medicine and education were perverted for use in killing, disabling, and in fomenting racism, hatred, and destruction. As our annual Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration draws to a close, it is incumbent on every one of us here today, from whatever religious, ethnic, cultural, or political persuasion, to rededicate ourselves to truly eradicating intolerance from our midst. We must endeavor to silence the voices that seek to deny that the Holocaust ever happened, and we must prevent a distortion of the memory of the Holocaust that would attempt to deny the Jewish people their past and their future. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us in this evening of solemn commemoration.